During dinner, my daughter-in-law snapped and hurled a glass of wine straight into my face, hissing, "You're useless good for nothing," because I refused to pour more. She staggered, drunk, in my house. In that instant, something in me broke. After 3 decades at the county courthouse, I knew exactly what to do to show who sets the rules in this home. Before I continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. The chandelier hummed, a faint electric insect above our heads. Wine slid down my cheek in a warm ribbon and found the lace runner that I bought the year my husband died. The goblet spun on the hardwood, a bright ring of glass against the wood, then settled with a tiny click that sounded final. Sabrina still held her hand out, palm up, as if the world owed her a refill. Her lipstick was smudged. There was a laugh on her face that never reached her eyes. "More," she said, lifting the empty air. "No," I said, the word quiet as a folded napkin. Luke stood between us in the hallway, shoulders rounded the way they had been as a boy, when he thought he could make storms pass by standing very still. His mouth opened. He looked at me. Then at the wine streak across the runner, he did not move. "Mom, do not," he whispered, like a prayer to the wrong altar. I reached for the roll of paper towels. My hands were steady. The bottle on the sideboard was half full. The stopper had a clean diamond shape that caught the light. I wiped my face and felt the cut on my brow sting and settle, the way old pains learn their place. I folded the towel and set it aside. The clock in the kitchen ticked once, twice. I heard the refrigerator motor come alive. "This is my table," I said. "Then learn to serve," Sabrina answered. She swayed a little, gripped tight on the back of a chair as if the wood was a leash she meant to yank. Her smile returned. It had no warmth in it. She looked at the bottle. She looked at me. She did not look at the blood that had found the seam on the linen. I gathered breath, not for shouting, but for naming what was true. I did not owe her wine. I did not owe her my silence. My patience had broken, but not the way she wanted. It broke into clean lines that told me where to place each step. Evidence first, emotion later, the order I had lived by for 30 years. I picked up my phone. The camera opened to the last frame from a week ago, a photo of the garden where the rosemary was going wild. I tilted the phone and captured the runner, the glass, the splash, my cheek. I said the time out loud and the phone heard me. I bent, gathered the largest shard with a dish towel, and set it on a plate. I could already see the paper bags I would use, not plastic. The labels I kept in the drawer by the stove would be enough. Numbers 1 through 4 would do. There is comfort in the small work of order. Luke made a small sound, the kind that breaks a mother and builds her in the same breath. He took a step toward me, then toward Sabrina, then stopped with his hands hanging there as if he might catch a falling lamp. "Sabrina," I said, the word low and even, "sit down." She laughed again. "No one tells me to sit down in my home." "This is not your home," I said. The words dropped like keys into a bowl by the door. She blinked. She glanced at Luke. He looked at his shoes. Her chin lifted. I knew then that she would try to make a spectacle because spectacle was all she had. She would raise her voice and claw at the air and make the room feel smaller, then insist that I was the one who had caused it. I kept my voice level and my hands slow. I walked to the sink and ran cool water over the cloth. A bead of red swirled and disappeared down the drain, as eager to leave as I was to be done with this version of my house. "Keep pouring," Sabrina said. Her tone slipped. "Honey over gravel, you do not get to say no to me." "That is not how this works," I said. I pressed the cloth to my brow and let the sting talk for me. The sting said I was alive. The sting said this was a line and it had been crossed. The chandelier hummed. Outside, a night bird called once. I saw the reflection of the room in the window above the sink. Luke was still there, head low. Sabrina swayed, her hair falling over one eye. The bottle watched us all. "You are not going to boss me around like some old courtroom," she said. I did not answer her. I looked down at my hands and saw they were steady. I opened the drawer by the stove and found the small roll of white labels. I wrote the number 1 on the first label and pressed it to the plate with the shard. I wrote the number 2 and stuck it to the stained corner of the runner. I wrote the number 3 and placed it on the towel with the first streak I had wiped from my cheek. I wrote the number 4 and stuck it to the empty goblet, tilted on its side like a fish that had learned silence. "Mom," Luke said again, almost to himself. Do not make this worse. I turned to him. My son, I said. Look at me. He did. For a second the boy was there with the skinned knees and the science fair ribbon and the heart so big he could not find enough room for it. I wanted to take his face in my hands. Instead I said what the moment needed. Go to your room. This will be handled. He swallowed. His eyes moved to Sabrina. She had the glass in her hand again, not thrown now, just held in a way that said I could throw you a new pain if I chose to. She lifted it like a toast to her own reflection in the window. He did not move. I reached for the brass mailbox key that always sits in the small dish by the kitchen switch. It was warm from the light. The weight of it fit into the old curve of my palm. I closed my fingers around it and felt the small teeth press into my skin. Enough, I said, and the word left the room like a breath you have been holding too long. Sabrina snorted. Enough what? You think you scare me. You do not scare me. You are lucky we let you live in this museum with us. My museum, I said. My door. My electricity bill. My name on the deed. The list was a ladder. I climbed it, rung by rung, and found air at the top. Luke, I said more gently. Upstairs. Now. He went. Slow as a cloud shadow over a field, but he went. The hallway swallowed him. A door clicked. The house grew quieter. The chandelier kept its small hum. My cheek cooled. I placed the plate with the shard on the counter and slid the towel into a paper bag from the pantry. I folded the top once, twice, pressed my palm across the fold. I could see the night ahead already, the list it would ask of me, the phone call, the calm voice on the other end, the language I knew better than any lullaby, the name of the charge. The way you ask for a case number and write it down. The way you ask for a temporary order and provide each detail clean. Sabrina leaned on the back of a chair and watched me. She seemed to be waiting for me to scream, to cry, to beg. She was not prepared for paperwork. Most people who hunger for power are surprised by paper. Paper does not raise its voice. Paper does not shake. Paper simply records, then tells a stranger in a black robe what happened and what must happen next. You are not going to win, she said. You think Luke will choose you. He will not. He is mine now. I met her eyes. We will see, I said, and turned off the tap. I checked the stove. I set the bottle upright and pushed the cork in with quiet pressure. I wiped the last round curve of wine from the runner and folded it in on itself, stain to stain, so it would not spread. I placed it in the second bag, pressed the label down, and smoothed it with my thumb. The night had a new temperature then, the kind that comes after thunder when the air is still deciding what it wants to be. I carried the bags to my office at the back of the house, the room where I keep the records of my life. The floor is old pine. The desk is oak with a scratch in the shape of a river that my husband never managed to sand away. I set the bags on the desk and turned on the small lamp with the green shade. The light pooled like a promise. In the doorway I could feel the house hold still, the way a body does when a doctor places a stethoscope on the skin. The breath of it slowed. The walls remembered their work. This is a home, they said, not a stage. I closed my hand around the brass key once more, then set it beside the lamp. Enough, I said again, softly. Then I walked back toward the kitchen where the phone waited and the clock kept honest time. The faucet kept its thin silver stream, and I let it run while I worked. The drip found the metal sink in a steady metronome, and every beat matched my pulse. My hands did what they always do after chaos. They tidied the edges. They numbered the small things so a stranger could later understand what had felt like a storm. As I folded the runner inward on itself to keep the stain from blooming, the night reached back and pulled a thread. 6 months rewound in the space of one heartbeat. They arrived on a rainy Sunday with the kind of smiles people wear when they are already rehearsing their excuses. Temporary mom, just until we save for a place. Boxes stacked in my entry like visiting soldiers. Luke lifted the heaviest one and said he would fix the loose gate and finally repaint the back steps. Sabrina announced the kitchen had good bones, then opened every cabinet like a realtor. She set her purse on my table. I remember that part because it left a small ring on the wood, and she laughed and said you can sand anything with the right paper. She was not speaking to the table. We said grace and ate leftover pot roast. She asked if I had a spare key because she was going to start early at work and did not want to wake me. I copied one at the hardware store the next morning. She said thanks in a voice that felt like I owed her more. I pushed past the feeling because pushing past small feelings is how a mother keeps a home from rattling apart. A week later, a locksmith flyer showed up in my mailbox for new homeowners, addressed to her name with my street number and my house pictured in the corner. I held it a little longer than I needed to, then slipped it into the drawer with the takeout menus. It did not feel dangerous. It felt like the first draft of a boundary test. By the second week, Sabrina had a habit of taking calls on the porch. She said the office needed quiet for client numbers, and she did not want to clutter my kitchen with stress. She wore the headset even when the porch was empty, and spoke in the kind of voice people use when the other person is not really listening. Luke told me her job had shifted, and that she might be remote more often. He said they were saving $300 a week this way, and soon they would be out of my hair. I told him I do not mind hair when it is clean and says thank you. He laughed, then looked out the window as if the answer might be on the neighbor's azaleas. I kept my routines. Mornings with coffee and a small prayer for steadiness. Afternoons at the library where I volunteered to help seniors notarize their forms. Evenings with the lamp in my office and the oak desk that still bears my husband's river scratch. Every time I came home, the pressed fern in the shadow box by the switch caught the light. It lay between glass and paper, the way a quiet rule lives between two people. Fragile, clear, kept. I prefer rules because they keep people from pretending. It is not about control. It is about the agreed-upon shape of a life. You wash your plate, you put your paycheck in the joint account. You say if you lost your job, you do not move a name onto a bill that is not yours. You do not take a key and order a locksmith without a word. You do not turn a home into a stage where you are always center and the rest of us are props. That first month I noticed small swaps. My cream vanished faster than it ever has. The spare room light burned all night. A parcel came addressed to Luke, care of Sabrina Cole at my street, and he said she was sending supplies for work, and please ignore the label because HR had things wrong. I ignored it because I was busy ignoring the way he looked smaller when she entered a room. I am not bitter. I am clinical when I need to be. 3 decades at the courthouse taught me you can love a person and still name the facts clearly. One evening, she asked what I used to do, and I told her court administration. She said, "So you were paperwork?" And I said, "Paperwork is how a city keeps its promises." She smiled, the kind of smile that removes warmth from the air. She said, "Good to know." Later that week, I found my little bundle of certified mail green cards tucked under a cookbook on the counter. I asked Luke if he had been looking for a recipe. He said no and raised his hands in a small shape that meant he was done answering questions he had not asked. I returned the cards to the drawer with the labels and felt the first real click of something important. We set a schedule to keep the peace. Monday I cooked. Tuesday they ordered noodles. Wednesday Luke grilled and I made the salad. I gave them Fridays to have friends over with the single condition that the house be treated like a house, not a bar. Sabrina agreed while looking at her phone. The first Friday went fine. The second Friday was louder. She introduced me to new people. As "This is Maggie the landlord." Luke corrected her and said "my mother," and she shrugged as if the words were interchangeable. After they went to bed, I wiped rings from the end tables and counted 6. I am not a tally keeper. I am a witness. My hands do the work because my mind is recording. By the 3rd month, the temporary had hardened into a word with no exit. The saving story changed a little every week. There was a fee here and a dentist there and a once-in-a-lifetime travel deal that had expired, so why mention it? Luke started wearing sweaters in weather that asked for shirt sleeves. He said the clinic was cold. I gave him a wool throw that had been my mother's. He draped it over the couch and said thanks with a voice that had once belonged to a boy who always believed he could fix things. He tried to please everyone and ended up pleasing the loudest person in the room first. I am not a hero. I am a woman who knows where forms live and how many photographs make a story look like the truth it is. In the 4th month, I took a walk around the block after dinner, and when I returned, the deadbolt was turned from the inside. My own key fit but would not throw because the chain was on. I knocked. Sabrina opened the door half an inch and said, "We thought you had a late shift at the library." She took the chain off with a sigh like a landlord doing a favor. I stepped into my foyer and felt the house lean into me the way an old friend does when your hands are finally free. I told myself I was being dramatic. Then I told myself again that quiet women often mistake drama for instinct and call it rude. I set that thought in my pocket and kept walking through the evening. In the 5th month, the bank postcard arrived, reminding me to check my credit freeze status and alert settings. It was addressed correctly but had a second name printed faintly beneath mine like a watermark. I held it up to the lamp. The name made my stomach cool. Sabrina had never asked to be on my anything. The card went into my file and I wrote a note in tidy courthouse script to call the bank and review account contacts. That night Sabrina made a toast with my crystal and said to new chapters. Luke laughed. I smiled and said nothing and wrote a date in the corner of my planner, small enough that only I could see it. When the 6th month began, she started keeping her purse on the kitchen counter and her phone face down. I do not watch anyone's phone, but a lock screen does not ask permission. The alert tone was familiar. It was the same bank I use and the same sound Luke's phone makes when deposits land on Fridays. Only these were not deposits. Red numbers appeared in one of those banners that comes and goes. I looked away and felt my pulse skip the way it does when a case pivots on a single overlooked line. That is all it takes. One overlooked line and a life swerves. The faucet kept its thin song and the drip counted us all back to the present. I clicked the handle off. The house breathed. The shadow box by the switch caught the last of the kitchen light and the fern held its shape between glass. I prefer rules because they keep people from pretending. I turned from the sink and carried the labeled bags toward my office. The floor under my feet tasted like steadiness. Behind me the chandelier hummed. In front of me, the phone waited with the kind of patience that outlasts shouting. I was not bitter. I was ready. I closed the office door and let the house shrink to a manageable size. The lamp with the green shade threw a neat circle of light on the oak desk. I set the paper bags down and opened the ledger. The pen felt familiar. My hand moved before my feelings did. I wrote the date. I wrote the time from the stove clock and from the phone screen to match. I wrote the location as kitchen table. I listed the items I had labeled 1 through 4 and described them in plain words. Towel with blood from brow. Lace runner corner stained with red wine and blood. Large glass shard placed on white plate. Empty goblet lying on its side. I wrote that the subject staggered and that I refused further alcohol service. I wrote that a cut had occurred along the right brow. I kept each line clean. No adjectives, no guesses about motive. The story stays honest when it keeps to things you can point at. In the hall, the house made its small midnight noises. A pipe ticked. The wind touched the siding and moved on. The rest I kept out by choice. I folded the towel inside a clean one and slid it deeper into the first bag so fibers would not migrate. I folded the runner once more and breathed in the faint detergent that has lived in this house longer than any of us. I sealed both bags with masking tape and wrote the time again across the seam. The shard on the plate caught the lamp and threw a tiny white line on the desk. I slid the plate into a fresh paper bag so I would not leave fingerprints where I did not need them. Habit is a mercy when the heart wants chaos. I stood and eased the office window open 2 inches. The night air had a clean edge that helped the room think. I washed my hands in the small sink I keep for ink and glue and let the water run just long enough to carry away the metallic taste of the cut. I turned it off and listened to the drip end. The house settled with me. I checked the time again, after midnight by a few minutes. That is a good hour for a call that does not need lights and sirens. I sat with the phone on speaker and dialed the non-emergency line I have written on a card in the ledger's back pocket. The operator answered with the practiced calm of people who speak to strangers in trouble. I gave my name and address. I stated this is an assault by a household member and there are no weapons. I said the aggressor is intoxicated and currently upstairs. I said the incident occurred earlier in the evening and the scene is quiet now. I asked to file a report and to have an officer come when they are able in the morning. My voice surprised me by how steady it sounded. The operator asked if I needed medical attention. I said the cut is minor and controlled. She asked me to confirm that everyone was safe for the night. I said yes and added that the door to the aggressor's room is closed and there is no active disturbance. She read back my details and gave me a reference number for the call. I wrote it in the ledger without pressing too hard on the paper. When I ended the call, the room stayed the same size. That is the gift of procedure. I set an extra clean pillowcase on the chair for the morning. I put the paper bags into the bottom drawer beside the manila folders I keep for taxes and warranties. I left the ledger open to the page and placed the pen across the top like a small bridge I could walk back over when dawn came. On my way to the kitchen, I paused by the switch. The shadow box caught my eye even in the low light. The pressed fern lay perfectly still between glass and backing, every vein preserved. It reminded me why rules matter. They hold a shape when everything else wants to spread. I touched the frame once. Then I gathered a glass of water and turned the faucet to a thin thread so the glass would not chatter. As I passed the staircase, I listened. A changed rhythm is a warning. Tonight the stairs kept their ordinary hush. Luke's door was closed. Sabrina's door was closed. No voices, no heavy feet. I stood there long enough to be sure and then went to my room. I set the alarm for early. I slept without dreams that I can recall. There are nights the body refuses the replay. I took the body's mercy. At first light I was up. The cut had purpled at the edge and then settled into a sober line. I made coffee and buttered toast because the stomach is part of the decision-making whether we admit it or not. I kept the kitchen quiet. I did not set the table. I did not brew a second pot. The chandelier hummed as it always does, the small sound of a machine that intends to keep its promise. At 7:30, a patrol car rolled slow past the house and returned to park by the curb. A middle-aged officer with gray at the temple walked up the path. He kept his hands visible and his face neutral. He looked like he knew how to enter a room without filling it. I opened the door before he knocked and stepped back to make space. He introduced himself and asked to come in. I nodded and led him to the kitchen. We sat at the table. He put a small field notebook on the wood and clicked his pen once. I handed him the ledger open to the page from the night before. I kept my voice short and factual. I stated that there had been an assault by my daughter-in-law in this kitchen during dinner. I stated that a glass of wine was thrown at my face after I refused to pour more. I stated that there were no weapons and that I did not fear immediate further harm. I stated that the aggressor was upstairs asleep and that my son was also upstairs. He asked to see the injury. I tilted my head and parted the hair above my brow. He nodded. He asked if I had medical treatment. I said no treatment necessary. He asked if there were any witnesses. I said my son Luke Hale present in the room at time of incident. He asked if I had any evidence. I stood and brought the paper bags from the office and set them gently on the table. I narrated as I lifted each item without touching the surfaces that mattered. Towel with blood. Lace runner corner with wine and blood stain. Plate with recovered shard. The empty goblet. I also showed him the photos on my phone. Time stamped. He took his own photographs with his department camera and then asked permission to collect the items. I consented. He placed each into his own evidence bags and sealed them. He read the case number as he wrote it. I wrote it into my ledger's blank space where I had saved a line. He asked if I wished to file a formal complaint. I said yes. He asked if I had any immediate safety concerns. I said I would like guidance on obtaining a temporary protective order and asked that Sabrina Cole be advised not to return to this address if ordered by the court. He explained the process in simple steps. He handed me a pamphlet with the courthouse hours and the window where you file. He did not hurry. He did not soften the language. People underestimate how much dignity lives in a straight sentence. Upstairs, a door hinge sighed. He glanced toward the hall. He asked whether I wanted to proceed now or wait until the other parties were awake. I said we will proceed. He asked me to sign the statement he had written in his field notebook. He read it back to me. The sentences sounded like mine. Clean. Specific. I signed. He clicked his pen once. Luke came to the doorway in a t-shirt and stopped when he saw the uniform. His eyes moved to my brow and then to the bags the officer had sealed. He said Mom, and then said nothing else. The officer greeted him and asked him to confirm that he had been present. Luke nodded and looked at the floor. The officer asked if Luke had any injuries. Luke shook his head. The officer told him I had filed a formal complaint and explained that there would be a case number and a report on file. Luke looked at me with a face that had more years in it than it should. He did not argue. He did not defend. He breathed. Sabrina's door opened and closed again up the hall, as if a hand had touched the knob and then let go. The officer did not ask to wake her. He said he would submit the report and that I would be contacted with the next steps. He explained that if the aggressor attempted contact, I should call immediately. He placed a small card on the table with the case number and his name printed neat along the bottom. He tucked his notebook into his pocket. He stood. I walked him to the door. He put on his cap. He said take care in a tone that did not make a bigger promise than it should. He stepped onto the porch. The pen in his pocket clicked once as his hand brushed it. The front door eased shut with a soft catch that sounded like a room returning to itself. I held the case number card between my fingers until the edges warmed. Then I set it under the magnet beside the stove where the green of the certified mail receipts waits its turn. The courthouse air always smells faintly like paper that learned to keep its secrets. I dressed in the dark blue suit that still holds its shape and drove without the radio. The case number card was in my pocket like a small stone. In the hallway outside the hearing room, I pressed 2 fingers to my brow and felt last night's cut settling into a sensible line. An officer passed with a clipboard. A clerk called a name that was not mine. When our turn came, the room did what rooms do when law sits down inside them. It quieted. The judge read the file without looking for drama. I stated the facts in short sentences that did not need my opinions to stand up. The officer's report was clean and complete. I said I was requesting a temporary order for protection with distance and no contact. Sabrina spoke only to say it was all a misunderstanding and that I wanted to make her look bad. Luke sat on the back bench with his hands folded so still you would think he had been carved there. The judge asked whether there were weapons in the home. I said no. She asked whether I feared immediate retaliation. I said I feared the pattern more than the moment. She nodded once. The order was granted for 90 days. Distance and no contact. No approach to my person. No approach to my door. No third party using Luke as a messenger. A paper copy slid across to me with a stamp that sounded like a small gavel. Sabrina stared at me with eyes that asked for a fight I would not give. When we stood to leave, she called after Luke in a voice the bailiff did not like. He shook his head once and she fell quiet. Outside the room, Luke said it was an accident and touched the doorframe like a man learning how to stand again in a hallway that used to be safe. I said I heard him. I did not agree. Back home, I changed the locks. The locksmith worked careful and neat while the afternoon heat pressed against the porch screen. I watched the old cylinder come free like a tooth that had needed pulling for months. When he handed me the new keys, my hand remembered the brass mailbox key the way a palm remembers a friendly weight. Luke stood with his arms crossed as if he needed somewhere to place them. He asked if he should take the couch for a few nights until things calmed down. I told him the guest room was his. I told him the couch was a bad place for a back, and a worse place for a man trying to remember what a boundary feels like when it is not a demand. Sabrina sent 3 texts that afternoon. All of them held heat without light. The order made them violations if she kept going. I did not answer. Luke's phone lit up and went dark and lit again until he turned it face down. He said she is upset, and he said I am not taking sides, and he said it was just the wine, and he said the words accident, and one time, the way a person tries to shrink a house fire into a candle. I listened and placed the green certified mail receipt under the magnet on the stove hood where his eyes go when he cannot bear to look at mine. A small green square is not an argument. It is a promise that paperwork is about to leave this kitchen and go to someone who signs for it. While the locksmith packed his tools, I sat at the kitchen table with my ledger open. I pulled the folder where I keep identity documents and found a limited power of attorney Luke signed 2 years ago when he had his wisdom teeth out and asked me to manage his paperwork for that surgery week. It had never been revoked. I placed it beside my driver license and his birth certificate. Then I called a credit bureau and asked to place an initial fraud alert in Luke's name. The woman on the line spoke slowly and said the alert would notify the other bureaus. She asked for verification. I provided it from the POA and answered the questions that only a person who pays attention can answer. Which street did you live on in college? Which bank held a car loan 5 years ago? Luke stood at the counter holding the new keys and listened to the side of the call that did not need a loud voice to be real. When I hung up, I printed the confirmation and wrote the date in the ledger. I wrote the phrase fraud alert active and underlined it once. Luke rubbed his face with both hands and said, "Maybe you are overreacting." He said we can talk to her when she cools down. I asked him to sit. He did. I told him I would be pulling his annual credit reports that night and that I would help him place freezes if he wanted. I told him I would not lecture him. I told him I would simply show him what was there and he could decide how frightened he wanted to be. He said he was tired. I said the tired will pass and the numbers will still be true in the morning. The afternoon stretched into that quiet hour when the street learns to breathe again. I put on a pot of rice because it smells like comfort when it steams. I set out 2 plates because 3 would have been dishonest. The house felt the new locks and stood a little straighter. On the fridge, the green card made a small, bright square under the magnet. Beside it, the officer's case number card lined up like a sentence with a subject and a verb. At the kitchen table, Luke finally spoke to the surface of the wood. He said it really was just the wine. He said she had a bad day at work. He said the glass slipped. I said the glass was thrown and the words were chosen. I said the pattern is older than yesterday. I said I prefer rules because they keep people from pretending. He did not like that line. He said rules are your comfort, and I said that is correct, and also they are your safety. He stared at the green card and said, "What is that?" I told him a certified letter would leave this house tomorrow and travel to our bank and to a lawyer. I did not raise my voice. I did not raise my eyebrows. I raised a stamp. At dusk, I sat with the printer and a stack of envelopes. The first letter was to the bank fraud unit asking for a review of recent withdrawals and a hold notice on transactions that did not match historic patterns. The second was to a family law attorney whose name I trust because she sits straight in a chair and does not sell hope by the pound. I laid both letters on the table and slid them into their envelopes. The green slips waited like leaves that will not fall until I tell them. I filled them out with the address and my neat courthouse script. I licked the seams and pressed them closed as if sealing a wound. When the sun was finally gone, the mail slot clacked at some neighbor's hand farther down the row, and the sound made me smile because tomorrow would bring my own small clack. I held the 2 envelopes like a pair of birds and walked them to the front hall where the outgoing basket lives. Luke watched me from the couch with my mother's wool throw across his knees. He looked like a man sitting in a waiting room where the doctor is about to say a word he does not want to hear. I sat beside him. We watched the dark turn the window into a mirror. He said, "Do you hate her?" I said, "I am not in that business." I said, "I am in the business of making my home quiet." He said, "What if she changes?" I said, "People change when they want to and not because someone else made a list." He said, "Do you think I am a fool?" I said, "No." I said, "I think you have been loving in a place with no oxygen." He covered his eyes for a moment. He said, "What if I cannot breathe without her?" I said, "You are breathing now." I stood and straightened the envelopes again as if they needed courage. The night laid a soft hand on the roof. In the morning I would be at the post office when the doors opened. I would slide the letters across and receive 2 green slips back with lines I could follow. I would take the spare keys from the dish by the switch and hold them up and say, "These are yours." I would call the attorney and say, "I am ready to speak," in declarative sentences. The house hummed its approval. The chandelier kept its small promise. I turned off the kitchen light and felt the new deadbolt ease into place with a solid click that sounded like a future choosing itself. Colton Reyes answered on the second ring with the voice of a man who prefers numbers to noise. Retired state fraud analyst, now a licensed investigator, he said. I told him what I needed in simple lines: employment verification, credit lines and inquiries, prior addresses, civil dockets, any pattern that points to a plan, not a mistake. He did not sell me a promise. He offered scope and a fee and a time. Bring copies of identification, bring anything you already have. I said I would. His office sat on the second floor above a watch repair shop where the window kept a single brass clock that always read noon. Inside his door, the air smelled like paper and lemon oil. He was a compact man with gray at the sides and a neat shirt. He listened without interrupting and took notes with the kind of pen chosen by people who do not lose pens. When I finished, he asked 3 questions that told me he had understood before I said it. Who benefits? Who has access? Who is counting on you not to count? I slid a folder across his desk. Photocopies of the police report and the temporary order. Copies of Luke's last 3 pay stubs. The limited power of attorney he had signed for medical reasons that still gave me permission to ask questions on his behalf. My driver license. A list of the dates I believed mattered. He glanced through and nodded. He asked whether I wanted him to look at social media. I said, look for patterns of money, not photographs of birthdays. He smiled a little and wrote it down. He said, give me 72 hours. I said, I can give you 48 and a pot of coffee. He said we would split the difference. I left his office lighter and heavier at the same time. On the sidewalk, the watch shop clock still said noon. The real clock on my phone said almost 3. I went home to a quiet house. Luke had folded the wool throw and placed it at the end of the couch. He was at the sink rinsing his lunch dish by habit. He looked tired in the shoulders. I told him what I had done. He did not like it at first. He said, this feels like betrayal. I said, betrayal is whatever empties a life without consent. This is an audit. Look not to shame to save. He did not answer. He dried the plate and set it upright on the rack, as if that would give his day one clean thing. The first update came at dusk the next day. Colton called and said, "I think you should see this in person." I drove to his office with my palms warm on the wheel. He met me at the door with a manila folder, so thin it felt dangerous. Saturday, he laid out documents in an order that told a story without adjectives. First page employment, Sabrina terminated quietly 3 months ago. A layoff with no severance. The company email deactivated, but her personal voicemail still said the old title, Porch calls were just performance. He slid a printout of a public directory showing the last login date to an internal system that matched the termination week. He tapped the date without commentary. Second page credit, 2 high-limit cards opened in Luke Hale's name in the last 2 months. One at a store that sells things that glitter. One at a bank that likes clever ads. The addresses matched my house. The email on file was Sabrina's. The phone number toggled between hers and a secondary line I did not recognize. Balances nearly maxed. Minimum payments made from an account that was Luke's, but managed through a device ID that was not his. I stared at the page until the line stopped swimming. Colton said there is more, and his voice lowered not for drama but for respect. He turned his screen and showed me a screenshot he had permission to obtain through Luke's POA with the administrator at the retirement plan. 3 withdrawals from Luke's retirement account. They sat there in a column like stones. 1 in May, 1 in June, 1 last week. The sums together could have bought a small house if you did not mind the roof leaking. Authorization method digital. IP address linked to a modem registered to my home. He pointed to the timestamps. Midday when Luke is usually at the clinic. The screenshot felt both cold and hot under the lamp. He said, "I will prepare a formal packet. I will include the public records. For the rest you will need Luke to request full account statements and to swear to non-authorization. It will matter later that he says it himself." I nodded. He asked if I wanted to leave copies now or wait. I said, "Make me a set I can hold in my hand when I talk to my son." He slid pages into a clear sleeve and handed it across. The plastic made a sound like rain when my fingers caught it. I drove home without music. The house welcomed the car the way old wood does when it knows your footsteps. Luke was at the table with a mug he did not drink from. I sat across from him. I placed the clear sleeve between us and waited until he looked down. His mouth opened like a door the wind had found. He touched the edge of the page as if paper might be hot. He said, "This cannot be right." He said, "I never authorized this." He said, "Maybe it is a mistake and someone will fix it if we call." His finger followed the dates. He swallowed hard on the last one. His face lost its color without theatrics. I said, "I am not showing you this to humiliate you. I am showing you so we can stop the bleeding. We will call your plan administrator tomorrow and place a hold. We will ask for the logs. We will file an affidavit and a police supplement. We will ask the bank for recovery and place freezes." I spoke the steps like prayers I had said for years in halls where people confuse loudly with right. He nodded once, and then again. He said, "She told me the clinic needed my signature to help with some paperwork." He said she slid a screen across the table a few weeks ago and said it was a digital receipt for a vet supply order. He said I tapped without reading because the dog was sick that night and she looked tired. He said, "I am a fool." I said, "You are human." I said, "Abusers count on decent people to move too quickly." He put his hands over his eyes. I let him sit inside the dark for a minute. Then I said, "Stand with me in the light." I poured water. He did not drink. He asked how long had I known. I said I did not know. I suspected. The alerts on her phone, the layoff, the way she watched my mailbox like it owed her news. He flinched and looked at the doorway as if he expected her to materialize from the air at the mention of her name. He said she will hate me for this. I said she already hated anything that did not feed her plan. He reached for the clear sleeve again and stared at the numbers where his future had been. He said, "What do we do right now?" I said, "First, we breathe. Second, we move the accounts out of reach. Third, we see a lawyer with this packet." He nodded and then his shoulders sagged. He pulled at the neck of his shirt as if it had turned rough. The sweater he wore was too heavy for the room. He adjusted it higher. The motion was small, but the meaning was not. The fabric hid yellow that tried to heal under skin. My hands rested flat on the table so I would not reach for him like a nurse too soon with the bandage. "Look," I said, "not to shame, to save." He kept his eyes on the paper and pulled the turtleneck up another inch. The room went quiet the way rooms do when truth enters. The chandelier hummed exactly as before. The fridge did its honest work. Outside, a car door closed and the street returned to air. In that silence, I wrote a single line in the ledger. Packet received. 3 withdrawals disputed. Son ready to try. Then I closed the book gently and looked at my child, who was a man, and said, "We walk this in daylight, starting now." The coffee shop was a narrow room that smelled like cinnamon and burned hope. I chose the corner where the window held a sliver of sidewalk and a sliver of sky. Luke arrived with his shoulders too high and his eyes on the floor tiles. He sat and wrapped both hands around a paper cup he did not drink from. I set the clear sleeve on the table between us and waited. He looked, then looked away, then looked back until the numbers stopped blurring. His lips moved as he did the math of what should have been there, and was not. He said, "This cannot be real." I said, "It is real and it can be fixed in steps." He traced the dates with his finger the way a child traces a path through a maze. When he reached the last withdrawal, his finger paused. He breathed out in a sound that emptied something older than this week. He said, "After court she grabbed me." He touched the collar of his turtleneck as if it could answer for him. After the hearing, when the order was read, he said she grabbed my neck with her hand in the parking lot and told me I should have chosen better. He lifted the fabric, and I saw a faint yellowing where a thumb had lived too long. He pulled the cloth back up as if he could put time back over it. I said, "Thank you for telling the truth out loud." He said, "I feel ridiculous." I said, "Abusers count on that word to keep you quiet." He nodded and went still. We did not reach across the table. We let the small room hold us without a scene. The barista called a name that did not belong to either of us. The espresso machine exhaled. The cup in Luke's hands cooled without ever being his comfort. We left with the clear sleeve tucked into my bag and drove 3 blocks to an office with a brass nameplate that has not tarnished once in 12 years. Harper Lynn greeted us in a voice that respects time. She is not a promise seller. She is a map drawer. She asked for the story in short lines. I told her what the case number already held. Luke spoke the rest. The thrown glass. The RO granted. The withdrawals he did not authorize. The parking lot grip. He said, "I am not looking for revenge. I am looking for a way to live that is not braced for the next impact." Harper laid out the paths like lanes on a road. Divorce on fault grounds with financial and physical abuse documented. Request to convert the temporary protection into a permanent order after hearing. Pursue civil restitution for the retirement withdrawals and any credit opened without consent. File a separate criminal complaint for fraud if he is ready now or later when his breath is longer. She said, "No one has to be a hero in court. You just have to tell the truth with papers." She asked if he felt safe returning to my house. He nodded. She asked if he had access to separate funds and separate devices. We made a list. She asked him what outcome would let him sleep. He said, "I want my name to stop being a door she walks through." We signed a retainer. Harper collected copies and made a to-do list that included words that have kept many lives from breaking all the way. Affidavit. Freeze. Subpoena. Hearing. She handed Luke a small card with a crisis counseling number and did not make it sound like weakness. She said therapy is where you put your hands when they do not know what to hold anymore. He tucked the card into his wallet and breathed a little more fully. Back home, the house seemed to rise from its foundation and meet us at the door like it was glad we had a plan. I changed the sheets on the old twin bed in Luke's room and opened the windows so the curtains could learn the shape of spring again. We lined his dresser drawers with lavender paper from the craft store. The smell was soft and clean and carried a memory of my mother's closet on summer nights. Luke smoothed the paper with his palms as if he were ironing courage into it. He placed his folded shirts in neat stacks and said, "This feels like the first safe thing I have done in months." I said, "Small safe things teach your body what a good life sounds like." We ate soup at the kitchen table without pretending we were hungry. The chandelier hummed. The lock clicked the way a good lock does when it is sure of its job. Luke's phone sat face down but within reach, as if he wanted to prove something to himself. We watched the last of the light leave the windows. For a moment it felt as if the whole street had agreed to rest. The pounding started just after 10. A flat-handed anger on the front door that turned the night brittle. Luke looked at me with a face that still remembered being 8. My chair slid back without scraping. I stood and put one hand on his shoulder and the other on the phone. The doorbell rang twice in the middle of the pounding, as if manners could hitch a ride on rage. A voice outside called his name. The voice said, "Open this door right now," and said, "I know you are in there," and said, "You cannot lock me out of what is mine." The voice did not care that paper lived in our hallway now. I dialed with the accuracy that comes from practice and spoke calmly. "This is a restraining order violation at my address. The subject is at the front door attempting entry and shouting. No weapons that I can see. We are safe inside." The dispatcher said units are on the way. The pounding kept its rhythm for a few more beats and then paused. The porch light showed a shadow shift and return like a tide that does not learn. Luke whispered, "She will break the glass." I said the deadbolt will hold, and even if it did not, the law would. He sank into the couch and gripped the wool throw as if it could be a hand. The pounding resumed and then turned into kicks that hurt the air more than the door. Neighbors' lights came on in silent rectangles. I stood where she could not see me and kept my voice low for Luke alone. "We are not going to answer. We are going to let paper knock back. Sirens are not loud when you are waiting for them. They are a promise kept." The patrol car rounded the corner and washed the front room with blue. The pounding stopped, and the voice tried a new tone that sounded like a child who has been told no for the first time in years. The officers spoke in sentences that allow no misunderstanding. We stayed where we were until the radios crackled with the words I know from other rooms: detained, violating order, transport. Luke let out a breath that sounded like something leaving his ribs. He said, "Is it over?" I said, "This piece is over and the next begins tomorrow at the courthouse." The cruiser's lights slipped along the ceiling like water. Then they were gone, and the house remembered its original color. We stood with our hands on the backs of chairs and waited for the room to settle. It did. I picked up the phone when it rang. The officer on the line delivered the facts with the care of someone putting fragile things on a table. They had her. She would be held pending a bail review in the morning. They would file the violation report and provide me a copy for my hearing packet. He asked if we were all right. I said yes. He said, "Call again if anything changes." We thanked each other for being the kind of strangers who meet on the best terms possible. After I hung up, the quiet inside the house was not emptiness. It was a container with a shape. Luke stood and looked at the front door as if it had become a person who had done him a great kindness. He said, "I feel shame." I said, "I know," he said in relief. I said, "I know that too." We sat for a minute and let both live without wrestling. The rooms dimmed themselves to the level I keep when the day has done all it can. I walked to the kitchen and touched the shadow box by the switch. The pressed fern waited between glass and backing like a rule that had survived a storm. I pressed my palm against the frame and whispered what I needed the walls to remember. "This is a safe threshold." The phone rang mid-morning while I was folding towels in thirds the way my mother taught me. Harper said the district attorney had an offer and that we should be at the courthouse at 2. Luke set his mug down without drinking. We drove in silence with the clear sleeve on my lap like a small animal I meant to protect. The conference room was a square of neutral paint and a table that could hold more history than we brought. The DA spoke in clean lines, a plea to financial fraud and to violating the restraining order. In exchange, the defense will accept a no-contest divorce and a full waiver of any claim to your assets now or later. The state will recommend a capped prison term followed by supervised probation. Restitution is structured to return retirement funds and cover fees tied to the credit lines opened without consent. No contact remains. Mandatory counseling for anger and alcohol. The DA looked at Luke, not through him, and asked if this served safety and repair. Luke nodded once, and then again. We walked the offer to a bench in the hallway where light from a high window dusted the floor. Harper laid out the terms again and underlined the parts that matter after the day ends. Restitution goes first. No contact made absolute by the court. Divorce finalized without a fight over property. Supervised probation means every misstep is a string that pulls her back. Luke stared at the page and then at his hands. He said, "I wanted something that would not make me feel cruel." Harper said, "This is not cruelty. This is a boundary enforced by law." He took a breath that sounded like a screen door finding its frame at last. In the courtroom, the air kept its courthouse temperature. The judge took the bench with a file that already knew our names. The prosecutor stated the offer. The defense agreed without decoration. There were no speeches. The judge asked Sabrina to confirm her plea. She did. The judge read the terms like a list meant to be followed and not admired. 2 years in custody, then 3 years supervised. Restitution is set out in the schedule. No contact with the victims, direct or indirect. Enrollment in anger management and alcohol treatment as conditions of release. No contest divorce to be filed and finalized with waiver of any claim to current or future assets of the Hales. The judge asked if we understood. We did. The gavel touched wood with a soft sound that felt like a door closing gently but firmly. Sabrina turned once as deputies moved her toward the side door. There was a flicker in her eyes when she realized the room would not give her a scene. Luke looked at the table, then at the seal on the wall, then at nothing at all. He did not speak. He did not shake. He simply remained. Sometimes endurance is louder than triumph. We followed Harper to the clerk window for certified copies. The clerk is a woman I have known across counters for 20 years. She slid the papers through the slot and then paused. She reached under the work surface and brought up a manila envelope with my name in a careful hand. "Found in intake," she said softly, near a file cart. I took it and felt the weight of something wrong that had been waiting to be right. Inside was the marriage license application Sabrina had once lifted from my office desk 2 months ago while I was on the phone. She had smiled then and said it was for a friend who did not know where to get one, and I had said the word fine because I still believed yes can be kind when it is small. The form now sat unsigned with my address written in her handwriting in the box for future residents. A yellow post-it note was stuck to the corner in the clerk's small print that I recognized. "Pens are for real vows." The ink had bled just enough to look like a line drawn in water. I thanked the clerk. I slid the envelope into my folder without triumph. It was not a trophy, it was one more true thing. The con had been heading toward a public piece of paper that would have made the rest easier to argue. Without it, the frame of her plan lost a beam. I could feel my heart do nothing special. That is how you know a fact has crossed the room and taken its seat where it belongs. Harper glanced at the envelope and understood without me speaking. We stood together by the pillar near the door, and she said we moved to finalize the divorce paperwork now and file the restitution order with the plan administrator. The bank has already flagged the cards. She handed me copies of the orders in a neat stack, corners aligned. People think justice is thunder. Most days it is alignment. Luke stepped closer. He read the top lines of the certified copies and then traced the case number with his fingertip like a man learning a language slowly on purpose. He said, "Does this mean I can go home and sleep and not wait for the knock?" I said it means the knock has a place to report to if it ever tries again. He nodded and folded the papers into the inside pocket of his jacket with care as if paper could bruise. Outside the courtroom, we let the corridor swallow the sound of other cases, shoes on tile. Someone laughed too brightly and then remembered where they were. We walked without hurry. The elevator opened and we stepped in with 2 strangers who stared at their shoes. The bell chimed, a small note of permission. On the ground floor, the lobby was a bright rectangle of routine. Security wanted a belt buckle. A child asked for a snack and was told later by a tired father who meant it. On the courthouse steps, Luke stopped and looked up at the stone. He said I wanted to hate her to make this easier. I said hate is a noisy tenant. We do not have room. He took my hand once and then let it go. We crossed to the car where the clear sleeve waited on the back seat like a witness ready to rest. At home, the mail slot clacked with the precise sound I trust. I lifted 2 envelopes from the floor. The bank had acknowledged our dispute formally. The family law office had set our next appointment in neat black print with the hour and the room number. I slid the bank letter into the folder behind the case copies and clipped a green certified return card to the front with a small binder clip. The color made a quiet square in the kitchen light. I straightened the paper stack once with my palm so the edges matched. Luke stood by the stove and touched the magnet that holds reminders no one else would understand. He smiled without showing teeth. He said, "Can I cook tonight?" I said yes, as if the word were a key. He took onions from the basket and a knife from the block. The blade tapped the board in a rhythm that sounded like a house returning its voice to the people who live inside it. I stepped into the hallway and let my fingers rest on the shadow box near the switch. The pressed fern was still perfect in its glass frame. It is not glamour that keeps something whole. It is pressure applied just right and patience long enough to matter. I whispered for my own ears and for the wood that holds us. We did not put on a show. We put things in order. Then I turned back to the kitchen where dinner made the air honest and the new keys lay warm in the dish. We started with the doorframe. The old white paint had yellowed into a memory no one wanted. I stirred the can with a stick until the sage green found itself and went smooth. Luke laid a drop cloth with the care of a man who has decided to stay. The brush met wood, and the first stroke looked like a healed word. Slow, even, true. Sun slanted across the entry and lit the bristles as if the house approved. We painted the inside trim first, then the outer edge where hands always touch. It felt like blessing each place a person might cross. Between coats, I carried the ruined lace runner to the trash and did not flinch. In its place, I unfolded a new one from the linen drawer, where I keep things I do not use until they know they are wanted. The new lace was the same pattern as the old. Frost flowers that catch light and pretend it is still winter even in July. I spread it across the table and smoothed it with my palms. Then I set a small vase in the center with 3 sprigs of rosemary from the yard, because rosemary tells the room to remember only what will serve you. Luke came back with the brush balanced on its lip like a quiet metronome. He said, "This color feels like forgiveness." I said, "Forgiveness is a big word. This feels like boundaries that do not shout." He smiled with his mouth closed the way he did when he was a boy, trying to be brave for a school play. We let the paint dry and listened to the silence of a house that has decided not to accommodate anyone who breaks it. That week the bank letters arrived, the way good news often does, by looking like ordinary mail first. The plan administrator called to confirm the reversals were moving through. There would be audits and forms and one more affidavit and a few months of waiting, but the process had started. The sound of a stamp in a back office somewhere does more healing than 100 speeches. Luke checked each account with me at the table while the kettle sang. He set his credit freeze online and read each screen aloud so his hands would learn the new ritual. He said I did not know safety could be a series of small clicks. I said safety is mostly small and mostly repeatable. He went to his first therapy session on a Wednesday afternoon. When he came home, he stood in the doorway looking like a man who had found the edge of a map at last. He did not give me a speech. He said I told the truth. I said good. He said it did not kill me. I said it never does. He leaned his shoulder against the newly green trim and closed his eyes for a count of 5, then opened them to a room that was the same, and also different. I gathered my little roll of white evidence tags and walked them to the community center 2 blocks away, where the advocate group keeps a room with a long table and 2 carafes of coffee that always taste slightly like courage. The director is a woman with kind hands and a voice that does not tremble. I told her what they were and what they had done for me. She said we can use these to teach others how to hold a scene still long enough to be seen. I left the tags in a clear bin labeled training props and felt lighter, not because I had shed weight, but because my house no longer needed them. On a Tuesday, the postman slid a square envelope through the slot, and it landed on the rug with a sound I could identify by touch, even in the dark. The handwriting on the front would have fooled no one who had watched it move across other papers. I carried it to the table and did not rush. I made tea. Saturday. I held the envelope until it warmed and then opened it with the blunt knife that lives beside the sugar bowl. The letter was short and written in the careful hand of someone who wants to sound reasonable. She said the gift letter for a down payment had been fabricated. She did not apologize. She did not ask forgiveness. She placed a fact in my kitchen and left it there. I read it once and then placed it inside a plastic sleeve and slid it into the back of the folder without ceremony. No gloating, no story I would tell later to make myself larger. Just another true thing to file in a place that knows how to hold facts. Luke came in from the yard and saw the folder open. He asked if he should read it. I said only if it will help you stop circling a question. He shook his head and poured himself water. He said the question has been answered. He looked out the window at the rosemary and the fence and the sky that belonged to no one in particular and said, "I do not feel relief the way I thought I would." I said sometimes relief is the absence of a habit. We mounted the brass mailbox key in the shadow box by the switch. It had lived in a dish for years, waiting to be something more than a weight. We cut a small rectangle of cream paper and I took the good pen from the drawer. I wrote 6 words in the courthouse script that has always kept my hand honest. Boundaries keep love honest. I let the ink dry. Luke held the glass while I set the key beside the card, so the teeth faced down as if ready to work. We hung the box and stepped back. The fern kept its quiet. The key found its purpose. The card gave the wall a voice even when the house was empty. At dinner, we used plates without chips and ate slowly. The chandelier hummed its soft electric bee. Luke laughed once at a story about a client who brings the same anxious beagle to the clinic every month for reassurance. The laugh caught him by surprise, and he covered his mouth as if it had escaped without permission. He said, "I am not used to the sound." I said, "Let it practice." We washed the dishes side by side and left them to dry because sometimes you do not need to finish everything. Sometimes you need to let clean things rest in air. In the evenings, I walked the block and waved to neighbors who had pretended not to hear on the worst night and then made sure their porch lights stayed on. At the corner, Mrs. Alvarez asked if things were settling. I said yes in a tone that did not invite gossip, and she handed me a jar of quince jam without a word. Back home, I set it on the counter like a trophy I did not have to earn. The permanent order hearing came and went, with the steadiness I have come to love, in rooms where paper keeps the hours. Harper spoke exactly once, and everything else was already written. When we came home, I placed the certified copy behind the bank letter in the folder. I clipped a green return card to the front with a binder clip and pressed the stack flat so the corners lined up. Luke watched me and said, "You like edges that agree." I said yes, and he said me too, and for the first time in months, his shoulders remembered how to be the frame of a man who does not apologize for standing upright. I do not pretend there was no grief. The house remembered sounds at odd hours, and I would pause in a doorway for no reason, and then remember why my hands felt empty. Sometimes Luke would wake in the middle of the night and sit on the kitchen floor with a glass of water and the wool throw across his knees. I would sit with him and we would not speak. The refrigerator kept its hum. The new doorframe held its green. In that quiet, nothing asked to be solved. We let the body catch up to the facts. On a Saturday morning, we took the last bag from the guest room to the charity shop and drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like cut grass and a bakery I never visit because I do not trust myself with a tray. We parked. Luke locked the car with a click that sounded like confidence and unlocked the front door with the ease of someone who is not checking the street over his shoulder. We stood on the threshold for a second because thresholds deserve respect. Then we went in and the house received us like a friend who had kept the porch light on. No parasites, no petitions, just quiet I earned and keep. If this found you at a kitchen table or in a small car on a lunch break or in a bed that does not sleep yet, tell me the city you are listening from and share one small ritual that keeps your home steady. A clean mug on the counter, a lamp you turn on before dark, a key in a frame by the door. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.